Would you pray with me? Now, Lord, grant that the words of my mouth and the meditations of our hearts might be acceptable in your sight. O Lord, our rock and our Redeemer. Amen. Last week, we began our Advent worship series, The Glorious Impossible, by focusing on the story of Zechariah and Elizabeth and the miraculous news that in their golden years they would welcome a son, John, who would bring the joy and gladness that only comes by turning back to God. When faced with this gloriously impossible proclamation from the angel Gabriel, Zechariah responded, "How will I know this is true?" Today we turn to another more familiar Annunciation story, the Annunciation to Mary, concerning her miraculous pregnancy that will change the world. The circumstances of her pregnancy are completely different than Zechariah and Elizabeth's. Theirs was more glorious than impossible. Mary's was surely more impossible than glorious. In fact, the news she received that night was not only biologically impossible, it was a threat to her very life, an impossibly hard reality to face. Given all that, Mary has every right to ask her own question in response to Gabriel's annunciation, but Mary does not ask, "How will I know this is true?" She asks a very different question. How can this be? Hers is not a question about knowing. It's a question about being. Zechariah needed to know how this message of Gabriel was true, how the glorious impossible could possibly happen. As the old saying goes, knowledge is power. If Zechariah can know how this is true, it gives him a measure of control. Mary's question, on the other hand, is not at all about knowing anything. It's certainly not about controlling. As we learned from Dr. Lapsley in Sunday school today, as a teenage girl, Mary had likely never been in control of anything in her life. Mary's question is about being. Her very being will be changed by this proclamation. She doesn't have to understand it. She doesn't have to get her arms around it. She doesn't have to know it's true. She must become this news. Now, just to remind the men in the congregation this morning, pregnancy is a whole different endeavor for a woman than it is for a man. Mary's got to be all in. Her full being will be demanded in response to Gabriel's proclamation, not just her intellect. So her question is not, "How will I know this is true?" It's, "How can this be?" For Mary, it's not about knowing. It's about being. It's fascinating that in Western Christianity, we've tended to focus on knowing when it comes to the virgin birth. Through the ages, the Zechariahs of the church, which is to say the old white guys who are the priest, surely experts on matters of conception and birth, we've come up with all kinds of doctrines to define the church's beliefs about the virgin birth. We strive to get our knowledge straight. Knowledge is indeed power. Our doctrines enable us to control the narrative, and in the process, we turn this glorious impossibility into an intellectual concept to be accepted or rejected. Accept it, you are faithful. Reject it, you are not. We've asked Zechariah's question, how do we know this is true? This is a scientific understanding of truth. I've got nothing against science. I'm very thankful for modern medicine. But it's a different question altogether. Is it scientifically possible for something like this to happen? Some say no, and as a result, they reject faith altogether. What a shame to reject faith in the name of science. Others say, yes, that's exactly what happened, and if you don't believe it literally, you're not a real Christian. In the process, the glorious impossible mutates into a litmus test for faith, orthodoxy. It makes virgin birth a question of means rather than meaning. Focusing on the literal means by which this did or did not happen. Both of these responses are driven by a desire to control. On the one hand, if the answer doesn't fit within my reason, then it didn't happen. I'm in control. The world can only operate within the capacity of my reason. Likewise, the literalist keeps control by removing any ambiguity, any need for interpretation. So in their minds, they're in control. Dr. Avi Loeb, who is a professor of astrophysics and cosmology at Harvard, says that good science and good religion share one thing in common: humility. He continues that bad science and bad religion also share one thing in common: arrogance. Arrogance is often exerted to control. But the Annunciation is not about control. It's about offering. Mary offering herself to God's unfolding plan for the salvation of the world. And so her question is not, how will I know this is true? Not about the means. It's about the meaning. How can this be? She's not doubting that God could manipulate the laws of nature if necessary. She's asking, how can I be the one to have a baby named Save? How can I be the mother of the Son of the Most High God? How can the one to redeem the world be born through me? How is it possible that I could be part of opening the doors to eternity? How can this be? It's a question born of wonder, not of control. It's about offering. It's not simply about means, it's about meaning. Thanks to the ancient philosopher Plato, we in the West have this unique capacity to separate our thoughts from our actions, our beliefs from how we actually live our lives, our knowing from our being. You see, Plato separated the mind from the body and the soul, and that enables us to believe things with our minds that actually have no direct impact on our bodies. So we can believe the tenets of the faith, and even if our actions fail to reflect any of our beliefs. Zechariah can know how Gabriel's words could be true without actually doing anything in response to that truth. And that's not an option for Mary. She's got to be all in. In her poem, After Annunciation, Madeleine L'Engle writes, "This is the irrational season when love blooms bright and wild. Had Mary been filled with reason, there'd have been no room for the child." Indeed, Gabriel's proclamation is not an intellectual proposal for her to ponder, not a new idea for her to consider. Gabriel's announcement requires her to give herself completely to God's unfolding plan for the salvation of the world. Her being will be redefined by this reality. So for Mary, it's not an idea, it's an action. It's not about means, it's about meaning. It's not about controlling, it's about offering. It's not about knowing, it's about being. So Mary does not ask, how will I know this is true? She asks, how can this be? And Gabriel responds, nothing will be impossible with God. And then Gabriel looks into Mary's eyes and waits for her response. All this will surely be dependent on her consent. Is she willing to give herself over to this glorious impossibility? How long do you think it took Mary to respond? Our readers in the sanctuary and also in Celebrate, they offered an interpretive pause between Gabriel's nothing will be impossible with God and Mary's here am I, the servant of the Lord. Do you think there was a pause? If so, how long do you think it lasted? Did Mary just sort of hold her breath for a moment? Or did she turn away from Gabriel and begin pacing about her room? Maybe she even sat back down on the bed to ponder for a while the implications of all this. In her paper for our preaching group, The Well, my friend Heather Shortledge writes, who knows whether the meeting between Mary and Gabriel lasted 10 minutes or 2 hours? God's plan hung in the balance. The choice of the poised young woman was the real hold your breath and hope moment. Would Mary consent to be a part of God's unfolding plan for salvation? Would she say yes? How long do you think it took for Mary to respond? How long would it take you? If I were Mary, I think I would negotiate a few things before agreeing to Gabriel's proposal. Tell you what, Gabe, why don't we wait until my marriage is final? I like to do things decently in order. The wedding's only 6 months away. Can't we wait until then? Our people have been waiting centuries for our redemption. And if my boy is going to reign over the house of Jacob forever and his kingdom will have no end, what's the rush? What's another 6 months, Gabe? Another issue, what about Joseph? How am I going to explain this to him? Would you be willing to make an annunciation to him? In Matthew's gospel, he gets a visit in a dream, but in Luke, Joseph isn't in on the story. And while you're at it, could you please pay a miraculous appearance to the next town council meeting to explain that all this is God's plan so that they don't stone me to death? If I were in Mary's sandals, I would have been looking for some wiggle room, some way to make all this more tenable, a little more sensible, a little more controllable. But that is not what Mary does. She may have responded immediately to this divine proposal, or it may have taken her a moment to ponder amid her perplexity. But ultimately, Mary says, here am I, the servant of the Lord. Let it be with me according to your word. Can you imagine that moment? She's given herself over to God's unfolding plan, welcoming the action of God, embracing its meaning, offering herself to whatever is to come, not knowing what lies ahead, willing to be part of God's redeeming work in the world. Can you see her in that moment? in the afterglow of Gabriel's glory, wondering, what now? All of that comes because Mary said yes. Can we? Will we? God has a way of showing up in our lives, choosing the least likely people to join in the glorious impossibles of new life springing forth, of good news for the poor, release to those who are held captive by the powers of this world, to join in God's work of reconciliation, God's work of redemption, God's work of resurrection, unfolding even now in our world. Because of who God is and how God works, all of our lives, indeed, this whole wide, wounded world is pregnant with possibility, inviting us not to accept an idea, but to join in the action, not to control the narrative, but to offer ourselves to it, not to understand the means, but to embrace the meaning and discover the life of faith, not simply by knowing, but in our being. How can this be? Nothing will be impossible with God. And so, beloved, with our sister Mary, may we respond with the glorious impossibility of faith. Here am I, the servant of the Lord. Let it be with me according to your word. Amen.